Welcome to Deep Tech Marketing Interviews. Today my guest is somebody who has an incredible amount of experience working at AWS and other large software vendors. In more recent times, he's worked as a bar raiser for Amazon and now works as an executive coach, teaching other organizations and individuals about best practices around recruitment. Please welcome Ed Jackson. Hi, Ed. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'd like to start by asking a question so people can get to know you a little bit better. So could you help provide a bit more background about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, hi Ollie. Thanks for inviting me on today. It's great to have a chance to speak to you about this. So I'm a business consultant, I suppose. Now I'll elaborate on that a little bit more in a few minutes. But I've had a couple of career changes in my professional life. I started out as a lawyer, so I did a law degree at university.
Mm.
Trained as a solicitor, worked as a commercial solicitor, working on mainly on contract litigation, commercial contract litigation. But when I was about 30, I suppose, so after I've been practicing and qualified for about 4 years, I decided law wasn't for me, so I got into IT, and this was in mid to late 90s. I mean, it was all kicking off in IT at that time. It's when people were first starting to become aware of what this World Wide Web thing was.
Sure.
Um, it seems odd to talk to my children who've never lived in a world without the World Wide Web or without mobile phones, but it was pretty big then, but it was just starting to explode. It was a really exciting area to get into. So I spent the next 26 years working for a number of big tech companies like Cisco and Microsoft, and then most recently for Amazon, and specifically within Amazon for Amazon Web Services, which is the cloud computing arm of AWS, which a lot of your listeners will know.
Mm.
Um, and I was in sales and sales management during that time, but one of the things I developed an interest in during my time at Amazon was in recruiting. And Amazon have this the program called the Bar Raiser program. Again, some of your listeners will be familiar with this phrase, and I think they'll probably see it in the title of this interview.
Mm.
But the idea of the Bar Raiser program is that senior, tenured, um, well-respected Amazonians are nominated to become what are called bar raisers. And alongside their sales jobs, their day job, so in my case, alongside my sales job, I was invited to be a bar raiser. I trained as one, and then that brings you into the recruitment process more regularly, where you become a senior interviewer on interview panels. You lead those hiring meetings. You make sure that everyone who interviewed the candidate is having their say and getting their point across and their opinions, their data. And ultimately, as a bar raiser, you have the final decision on whether that person gets hired for Amazon.
Mm.
And during my 10 years at Amazon, I was a bar raiser for just over 5 years, interviewed over 500 candidates in that time, and developed a real passion for not so much in talent acquisition, but in recruitment and
Sure.
hiring and the interview process. So when I decided to leave corporate life in 2022, which is when I left Amazon, after 10 years there, since then I've got into general business sales consulting. I do some career coaching and mentoring. I've recently started to do some audit work in the higher education sector. But probably most relevant to our discussion today, I also do recruiting consulting. So I help I help candidates applying for jobs to improve their interview techniques. But perhaps more interestingly, I've started to work with small and medium-sized businesses to help them improve the way they recruit and hire people to make sure that they're making long-term effective hires for their business.
Mm. Absolutely. I mean, one of the reasons why I was so keen to have you on the show is just because so many senior marketing professionals and developer relations executives I've spoken to working at scale ups and startups have to deal with this issue of recruitment. So I was wondering, for the uninitiated, can you outline some of the key principles behind the bar raiser process? You outlined a little bit of what it looks like in practice, but can you give us some context around what it's trying to achieve? What are the outcomes that Amazon is trying to drive in really rolling that out across the organization?
Yeah, yes, I can, and actually, I can talk about this stuff all day. So I'll try and rein myself in a little bit. But um, I mean, Amazon is huge now. When I don't remember the number of employees they had when I joined in 2012, but by the time I left, they had well over 1 million employees. I
Yeah.
mean, they'd probably grown 5 or 10-fold, something like that. And because they were growing so quickly, they were hiring really quickly, and everyone got involved in interviewing. And it's a rigorous process for anyone who's been through the interview process at Amazon as a candidate. They know it's rigorous. It's not what I would call brutal, but it's certainly quite challenging.
Mm.
Um, I think I can't remember when the Bar Raiser program was created, possibly in the 90s or early 2000s. But Amazon created this program called the Bar Raiser program, and the reason it's called Bar Raiser is that I think originally they decided to call it the barkeeper program. You know, we want to keep the bar high,
Mm.
so every time we hire someone, they're at least as good as the people who are already here. But actually, they thought, well, we don't just want to keep the bar where it is. We want to raise the bar with every hire. And I think one of the things Jeff Bezos has said is that, you know, when we assess a candidate applying for a job, do we believe that they will raise the overall effectiveness of the team they're coming into? So
Mm.
if there's say 10 people in the team, do we believe they're better than half of the people, than five of those people in the 10 in the team? And if we believe they are, then we think they're what's called a bar raising candidate, and we'll extend an offer to them. Now, the person who primarily facilitates that decision by convening all the interviewers, looking at the data they collected, going over the interview notes, assessing risks, strengths, concerns, is the bar raiser. And they're like an independent. They normally come from a team outside the hiring team, so they're free of any bias or loyalty, and they and ultimately they have a veto. So even if the hiring manager really wants to hire the candidate, and maybe the hiring manager, there's typically be 5 people on an Amazon interview panel. They don't interview together; they interview one after the other. So each individual interviewer interviews the candidate on their own. But even if the hiring manager and 3 of the other interviews are desperate to hire this person, if the bar raiser believes they're not a good long-term fit for Amazon, then they can veto the hire, no matter how loudly the hiring
Mm.
manager doubts about it. And what I'm coming to here is that bar raisers are selected because they're selected for their knowledge and understanding and adherence to the Amazon culture. And the Amazon culture, you could say, is most concisely defined by its 16 leadership principles, or corporate values, you'd probably
Yeah.
call them in the company. But Amazon has these leadership principles, and the value of the bar raiser program is that the bar raisers were brought in as independent, senior, trusted arbiters to make sure that Amazon was hiring for the long term. And you know, Amazon is more interested in hiring right than hiring fast.
Yeah.
So they build this patience, this need for patience into their hiring process, so that even a hiring manager who's maybe under great pressure from their own manager to fill a seat in the team for productivity reasons, there's a kind of natural check on the hiring manager's ability to do that, to cut corners. So the value is there in preserving the Amazon culture and making sure that people who come in are good long-term hires.
Mm.
Um, and I'll give you an example of that,
Yeah.
if I may. I was interviewing someone when I was at the company, and this was a very successful salesperson coming from another big tech company. But he told each one of us 5 interviewers. I was the bar raiser, but there were 4 other interviewers, and he told each one of us, unprompted, how much money he'd earned the previous year
Mm-hmm.
by this incredible, ruthless sales campaign he'd run with a customer. And he talked about the life-changing amount of commission he'd earned over this. And we were all left thinking, wow, this guy's a really effective salesman, but he'd be a terrible fit for Amazon,
Mm.
because he'd leave a trail of destruction in his wake. He'd be sucking up resources that other people need to use. And he might be successful, but it's not in our interests or our customers' long-term interests to hire someone like that. So we said no to that person. Now, that was actually quite an easy consensus that we came to, but that's the
Mm.
sort of situation where one type of sales manager might be very happy to hire someone like that because they're just thinking of short or medium term numbers rather than the long term downstream effects. But really the bar raiser program and the interview methodology at the company, where people are encouraged to look at data and think about cultural fit and fit with the Amazon leadership principles, is the thing that prevented that and many thousands of other potential hiring mistakes. And we were really proud to be able to operate in that environment, and the bar raiser program was a really important part of that. And in fact, Amazon described the bar raiser program as a competitive differentiator for them, and I think it
Sure.
is.
Yeah, yeah, no, no, absolutely. Can you talk about a little bit about how you've seen a first-hand impact or benefits or advantages as a result of deploying the bar raiser process, specifically within Amazon, and that might stand in contrast to recruitment processes you've seen or experienced in other organizations?
Well, I think what it
Yeah.
does, it brings it brings objectivity and data to the hiring decision. And you know, in that company, no one gets hired based on first impressions, or because they know the hiring manager, or they've worked with them before, or because they kind of blagged their way through an interview.
Mm,
And similarly, good candidates who maybe so someone once said to me, "Oh, I know within 30 seconds of meeting someone that whether that person's going to be a good hire for this role." That was not someone who worked at Amazon, by the way, and that is the absolute antithesis of the way Amazon works, because some
yeah.
people don't always make a great first impression, but if you start to delve into their career successes, then you can see that actually this is a person who would um, who would do really well here. So I think one of the things it does is it takes that first impression and gut feel out of it. If I think about other companies I've worked at, I've certainly seen people hired because they were the hiring manager's mate, or they came highly
Mm,
recommended, or they were kind of charming in the interview. But those people get into the company, and it soon becomes apparent that maybe that wasn't the best way to hire someone, and the first impression wasn't enough, and actually they're not delivering, or maybe they're creating a toxic environment in the team. I've seen that as well, and my
yeah.
my view is very firmly that it is really better not to hire anyone than to hire the wrong person. And I did see that. I did see us avoiding. I saw that helping us to avoid mistakes like that time and time again in Amazon. Now, there were mistakes made, of course. Some
Mm,
people did get hired, even though maybe they weren't. It turned out they weren't such a good fit. But I think the proof is in. I mean, Amazon doesn't publish its attrition figures, as far as I know, but the attrition figures in the company were significantly lower than some of its other competitors in big tech, and I think that is firmly down to the checks and balances and the rigor and the training that bar raisers go through to help achieve that.
mm. What would you characterize as some of the most challenging aspects of being a bar raiser? And can you talk a little bit how you overcame those?
Yeah, I think so just a little bit of context on how it works. So as I mentioned before, typically a candidate to Amazon would be interviewed by 5 people, one after the other, or spread over a couple of days. Then all the interviewers write their feedback and their assessment of the candidate. They write that independently without they're not allowed to confer with the other people. They write their feedback and cast their vote. It's not really a vote because it's not done on like a democratic basis, but they state what their recommendation is, hire or no hire. Um, and then once everyone submitted their feedback, then the team gets together for what's called a debrief, like a hiring meeting, which is chaired by the bar raiser, probably the most important. The next most important stakeholder on the call is the hiring manager, and there'll be 3 other people, maybe from the hiring manager's team or associated teams who are also part of the discussion. I think the biggest challenge in that situation is conflict management, because the bar raiser is normally from a different team. Then by their nature, the whole point is they're kind of meant to be independent, and so they may come in and they may find that every other interviewer, including the hiring manager, is really keen on the candidate and wants to hire them. And sometimes Amazon's quite a hierarchical organization, but even people people at all levels of the hierarchy are expected to speak up. It's one of their leadership principles, having backbone and disagreeing. So they're expected to speak up even if senior people are on the call. But I know in my experience as a bar raiser, um, there were several times when I was on a call where the hiring manager was, maybe quite a dominant personality, maybe 2 or 3 levels above me in the organization, maybe SVP level or something like that. And they might really want to hire someone that I really feel, looking at the data and following the discussion, I felt would not be a good fit for the company. So you get into this conflict management situation where, well, tempers aren't fraying because the conversation is always professional, but emotions are quite strong. And just being able to manage that conflict and, and reaching a consensus across the group that's the right decision for the company can be really challenging at times, especially when you've got very senior, quite domineering personalities on the call. And I mentioned before that the bar raiser does have a veto on any hire. So if everyone else wants to hire and the bar raiser doesn't, and feels it would be wrong to hire this person, the bar raiser can say, um, it's a no hire. This person is not right for the company, and the decision's no hire. So thanks for your feedback, but that's the decision. Now that process of using the veto is something I did very, very rarely. I did it, I think, maybe 3 times in 500 interviews. And actually, I always regarded it as a failure when I did that, because really what you're trying to do is to navigate this conflict management and reach a consensus so the rest of the team can make their own decision without you having to give it to them. Sometimes people go into the debrief and they all want to hire this person, and maybe the bar raiser is the only one who doesn't. But then the bar raiser, he facilitates a round robin discussion. They look at the risks, they pick into some of the data, and they point out the risks to the rest of the team. And I would at that point, towards the end of the debrief, I would say to the hiring manager, okay, well, these are the risks, these are the strengths. What do you think? And 99% of the time, the hiring manager would say, I think you're right, Ed. I think I was initially optimistic about this candidate, but there's too much risk. And then you kind of go around the room and everyone else says the same thing. So conflict management, not just to keep warring factions at bay, but, apart from each other, but to reach a genuine consensus where people's opinions change, can be challenging, but it's also a skill which becomes incredibly valuable in the rest of your working life. Managing a meeting like that, managing dissenting opinions, reaching a consensus. So it was a challenge, but it was a really important and beneficial skill that I learned in that process.
Hmm.
And it might also be worth saying that sometimes I went into these hiring meetings where I thought, yeah, great candidate, we should hire this person, and then I look at everyone else's feedback, and no one else wants to. They all think they're a weak candidate. So we still have the same discussion, and sometimes it's me changing my mind and saying, yeah, you're right, I was wrong. I didn't get that data in my interview, but looking at the data you got from yours, um, I can see that this person would not be a bad hire, so I'm changing my mind on this candidate. Would not be a good hire, so I'm changing my mind. So I think conflict management and reaching consensus can be quite challenging, but also really, really important business skills generally. And I felt I grew as a business professional during my 5-10 years, during my 10 years at Amazon,
Yeah.
because of discussions like that and skills I learned in the process.
What would
Um,
your recommendation be to a startup, a scale up, where you're dealing with a team size that could be anywhere between 15 to 30 people, doesn't have the resources of an Amazon, and there's a stronger bias to hire because you're expected to do more with less? Do you think the bar raiser process has a place in any size of organization, or is it unique to larger ones?
well, I definitely don't think it's unique, but of course it has to be modified. Um, if you look at smaller businesses, startups, scale ups of this sort of scale size you're talking about, you have to be realistic and pragmatic about the constraints that they're operating to. They probably don't have as big an applicant pool as a big tech giant like Amazon or Microsoft or Cisco does. They probably can't pay as much money. They're probably not as well funded and probably can't match the salary expectations of some of the most expensive candidates out there. And they also have to hire quickly. I'm working with one company at the moment, and we're having this exact conversation. They're saying, Ed, we love what you're talking about, and we think it's the right thing for us to do long term. But in the short term, we've got these incredibly pressing resourcing requirements for this project we've just won, and we just need to hire quickly. We just need to get people in. So I recognize that it's a balance of these constraints, and not everyone has the luxury of being incredibly patient and having such a high bar, um, as a big company like Amazon might do. But having said that, I think there are best practices to be learned from that sort of program, which can be applied regardless of the size of the company. And I think in some ways you could even say that it's even more important for a small company to get those hires right than it is
Sure.
for a big company, because if a company with 1 million employees hires 10 bad people, then it's just a tiny little rounding error. But if a company with 30 hires two poor people, then that's going to have knock-on effects throughout the organization. And I know from experience, it can take, even in a big company, it can take months or years to unpick a bad hire like that. So I think there are some best practices and elements of the Bar Raiser program around maintaining standards and being patient, that even small companies would do well to take on board.
Hmm.
Uh, whilst I recognise that there are some constraints, and I come from a luxurious position of working with a company with very, very deep pockets and very long-term thinking. So I recognise that my view is probably slightly rose-tinted because of that, but I still think some of those best practices can be incredibly valuable, no matter how big the company is.
Sure. Could you outline a few of those best practices as wisdom and advice for those working in kind of smaller teams that want to implement aspects of the bar raiser process?
Yeah. So when hiring, I think that the two things you're really looking for in a candidate are functional fit and cultural fit. Now, functional fit, if say you're hiring a technical person, a coding developer or someone like that, then you look at the functional fit. Do they understand these coding languages? Can they code effectively? What's their knowledge of these technologies? Do they have breadth and depth of technical knowledge in these specific areas that we're hiring for? And they're all what you might call functional requirements. And it takes all sorts of personality and professional types, um, who could meet that. But I think an even more important aspect of that, and this is what I've come to learn, is the cultural fit, and it's the candidate's fit against your company's values. So no matter how big you are, I think it's really, and it's not just a marketing or paper exercise or some sort of tick box exercise. I think it's really important for companies of all sizes, once they've been going for a while, to sit down and try and write down what their corporate values are. In Amazon, they're called leadership principles. In other companies, that they might just be called values. And it might be something like, well, let me give you some examples. So, being trustworthy, being kind and respectful. It might be, as I mentioned before, it might be having backbone. Willingness to disagree with people, even if they're very senior. It might be, we love to hire people who are really good with data and dive deep into problems, or you might have the opposite of that, where we say, well, that's kind of important, but it's even more important for us to hire people who get things done really quickly, even if they don't have time to look at the data. So I think it's really important for companies to understand what their values are, and that's kind of a starting point, and to write them down and think, well, what are our 5 or 10 or 15 values? Not values that we aspire to, because if that's not the way the company's operating, then it's not about aspirational values. It's about how people currently operate. Let's look at the most successful people in our company. What are their professional traits, character traits that we really like, and make them successful, and help to make our company successful. And I think once you've written down and understood those values, then you can start interviewing against them. So you can start, for example, if one of your values is being customer obsessed, customer comes before everything, then you might ask a candidate for, um, in the interview, for examples of the time when they put their customers' interests ahead of their own, for example. So, salespeople are a good example. Tell me about a time when this is your question to the candidate. Tell me about a time when you were under pressure from your manager to close a deal very quickly, but you knew that the deal your customer was about to sign was not in the customer's best interests. Now, in a really customer obsessed company, you would probably want a candidate who came out with an answer where they said no to their sales manager. They resisted the pressure, even though it meant some short-term personal pain for them, and they did the right thing for the customer because they knew it was in the customer's interest and it would build long-term trust with that customer relationship, which might not pay dividends this quarter or this year, but it will do in the long term because we're creating customer loyalty, and that's much more valuable to us in the long term. So when I talk about values and culture and defining those as a starting point for what you interview against to test for cultural fit, that leads me on to the second thing I'd say, which is, try and make use of behavioral interview questions or competency-based questions if you can. It's quite common hiring for, say, a sales role. I mean, I was in sales for 26 years, so a lot of my examples are around, thinking from a sales point of view. But it's quite common in a sales interview for the hiring manager to say to the prospective salesperson, okay, if you get the job, how would you approach the first 30, 60, 90 days? Now, the behavioral, that's a hypothetical question, really, because anyone can say, oh, I would do this, I'd do that, I'd work 26 hours a day, I'd close all these deals. But it's very easy to say that in a hypothetical sense like that. What I would strongly recommend is think about your values and get into these behavioral and competency based questions. So instead of that question, how would you do something in the first 90 days? Say, tell me about a time when you were starting a new sales job. How did you approach your first 30, 60, 90 days? And then you can start delving into what they did, how they planned out their year, how they analyzed their territory, how they segmented their customers, what sort of results they did, what campaigns they did, what sales activities. And then you can fast forward to the end of the year and say, okay, tell me how it worked out. Did you achieve 100% of your quota that year? What growth did you see based on the previous year? How many new customers did you win? So I would say, I think your question was about advice I would give, and I would say, firstly, define your values and be ready to interview against them. So write out some questions which you think are a good test for those values. And secondly, use questions which are behavioral in nature. And they often start with the words, tell me about a time when, or give me an example of. And there you are looking for real examples from the candidate's career. In my view, past experience is the best possible predictor of future performance, and that's why I think it's really important to do those, to use those types of questions, because I think it gives you a really solid foundation to assess how that candidate is going to perform if they get the job in your company.
I guess I agree with all of those different statements. One of the things that I see a lot is the kind of the bias to recruit, and sometimes anybody with a pulse will do.
Yeah.
What would you view your advice or insight to teams looking to bring in new talent into their organizations where they don't exactly have the best possible person for the role, but they're good enough?
Um, well, I think if they're good enough, that might be enough. But you need to be ready to be, um, confident enough to say, well, they're good enough at what they do. Functionally, they can do the job, but I have too many red flags with this candidate. If there's any red flags, really, you shouldn't be hiring them. Maybe they've got, you talk, one of Amazon's leadership principles, and I've seen other companies who have a very similar value is earning trust, being trustworthy. Now, if a candidate comes into you and through their examples, you can see they've got a track record of maybe not doing what they say they're going to do, or stabbing other people in the back, or taking credit for other people's work, then that's a red flag to me. And they might be good enough what they do, but that is still no reason to hire someone. It's really better not to hire someone than to hire someone like that. But I think a pragmatic halfway house where you need to hire quickly, and maybe you don't have the luxury of such a highly talented applicant pool as some of the big tech giants would have, is I've seen a lot of companies successfully hire people on a contractor basis. So they're easy to bring in, they're easy to get straight onto a job. You can throw a project at them straight away, and then as the project maybe dies down or that person turns out not to be a great fit for the company generally, then it's very easy to part ways with that person with no questions, with no hard feelings, because it was always intended to be a contract, a temporary contract. So I think for tech startup scale ups, I've seen that used quite effectively to bring people on, people in on a contractor or interim basis, because it takes some of the risk out of the situation. But certainly for hiring permanent staff, I still think that you've got to fight all your instincts sometimes and be a little bit patient and think this might solve a very short-term problem for me, but it's going to use up way more of my time in the long term if I hire someone who is maybe just about good enough or not quite there. And on a similar note, I also firmly believe that if you get three candidates and none of them is really good enough, I don't I really don't believe it's in anyone's interest to hire the best of a bad bunch, like the best of those three candidates. It's best not to hire any of them
Yeah.
than just to hire the best one. But these are all positions that you can take when you kind of have the luxury of patience or time. And I appreciate that in real life it doesn't always work like that. But I think the idea of hiring contractors on an interim basis is quite a good short-term workaround to meet those
Yeah.
urgent resourcing requirements.
That's some good advice. I'm interested to hear in regards to kind of the vast experience that you have. What trends do you see in the recruitment landscape as it exists at the moment? I'm particularly interested to hear your thoughts about how COVID and post-pandemic has shaped what's happening in the world of recruitment.
Well, I think in the world of um, the workforce generally, which I think ties back to recruitment, I think, and people got so used to working from home, and it was hard for people to adjust to working from home because a lot of companies didn't have the technology, did they, at that time? But I think once those hiccups were ironed out, and of course it's very easy to get on a video call like we are today, very very easy, and companies realised how easy it was, and they also realised that a lot of those in-person meetings could be replaced very effectively by video meetings like this, online meetings. Um, Now the long-term effect of that was that people got very used to working from home and working flexibly, and I think that's a real spin-off of COVID. People had to work from home, and they suddenly realised that actually it's quite good being in the office with my colleagues, but it's even better being at home. Where my commute is 3 meters across the landing and not an hour and an hour getting to London on an unreliable train service.
Absolutely.
Um, and I think what we have seen at some of the big tech companies is that there's been, COVID finally started to die down, and people were, encouraged to keep working from home. But a lot of the big tech companies and big companies generally are now saying, no, actually, we want people back in the office. There's the RTO, return to the office movement now, isn't there? And there's been a bit of a backlash against that. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out in the coming years as a trend, because I think there has been a backlash where some people have decided that rather than return to the office because they've been mandated to, they're more willing to look at moving from one of these big companies, big corporates, into maybe a smaller scale up startup where there are more flexible working arrangements. And I think that's a real USP that small companies can offer over the big corporates, because they can be flexible. So I think that's one of the trends I've seen. If I look at technical trends, and this isn't really anything to do with COVID or with recruitment, really, but everyone's talking about artificial intelligence now, aren't they? And there's no getting away from it. the rise in artificial intelligence, even over the last 12 months. I mean, it's been around for decades, artificial intelligence, but the rise in over the last 12 months, certainly the last 2 to 5 years, but even in the last 12 months, with the advent of ChatGPT and other generative AI options, it's astonishing the pace that it's moving at, and I think that will be a real trend, a technical trend, and I think it may, because of the investment that the big tech companies are making in those technologies, I think that may suck up some of the applicants which otherwise might have been, attracted to smaller companies. Okay, so I would say that there may be a trend to this conflict of the big companies who maybe have returned to the office policies, and so they want people in the office, but they're also trying to attract very high quality applicants in an emerging technology area where there's probably a shortage of talent. They're trying to attract those in the face of still wanting them to come into the office, and those applicants may want more flexible working arrangements. So these are a couple of things I think happening. I see happening, and I think if I were working with a small or medium sized company now, I would say, okay, there's probably going to be, there's this ongoing shortage of very highly talented applicants that you're able to attract to your company. So focus on what you can offer that the big companies can't. Your culture, your values. I talked about that before. The flexibility, flexible working. Think about maybe you're operating in a very niche technology area that some of the big corporates can't offer. A lot of the innovation now in technology terms is happening not just in the big companies, and of course they're spending billions on R&D, but a lot of the innovation is happening at startups, because they're able to move so quickly, and they might be laser focused on one particular problem they're trying to solve. So I think smaller companies can think about maybe attracting people to work in niche technology areas. Um, they can think about their values, they can think about flexible working, and finally, I think they can act with more urgency than some of the big companies can in attracting candidates and getting offers out. Um, I hear so many stories about big companies who, people apply to them and they don't hear anything, or they don't hear anything for 3 months. I mean, it's we've all heard the stories. In great companies, there are great recruiters, and there are actually really poor recruiters. And this is the candidate experience some people have. So I think if you look at the trends in the market and the way smaller companies can differentiate themselves and play on their USPs to attract the right people, I think speed and responsiveness are very important weapons for them.
I wonder what your thoughts are about global remote as well, which taps into what you're talking about, how smaller startups can attract and create offers for individuals looking to, say, work permanently on a remote basis. And the options created now with a lot more asynchronous kind of communication tools we have available, like Teams or Slack. And whether or not you're seeing any trends in terms of organizations moving to kind of global recruitment as opposed to the older models, which would be tend to hire people in and around the region where we operate, and insist on them coming into the office on a semi-flexible basis.
I think I am seeing that, and I think it gives particularly smaller companies more options there if they're willing to be open-minded, open to people who live hundreds of miles away from the office to working more remotely. And if you think about how, say, a systems integrator, a medium-sized system integrator may resource its customer projects, then it's perfectly feasible for that to be done remotely by someone living 200 miles away from the customer's offices. But I think on a more global scale, um, there's nothing new about offshoring, but I think the accessibility of particularly in technology, the accessibility of technical professionals who are much more affordable because they're in territories with much lower salaries and cost of living. I think that I am seeing more of that, particularly in software development. It's really quite feasible to hire software developers in in countries where it's harder to hire them. And I think on a related note, I'm seeing a real rise um, in the virtual assistant. You can hire a virtual assistant from, say, the Philippines or India, who speak brilliant English, very well organized, and they're highly competent, highly educated. You can get someone like that for a few $100s a month, and they're even prepared to work in your time zone, even though they live in a time zone which is 7 or 8 hours ahead of you. So I am seeing trends in a willingness to hire people from further afield, not just nationally but internationally as well, because it makes you faster. You can recruit faster, and you can get things done at a fraction of the price sometimes. So I think that trend will continue and probably grow.
Yeah. No, it's good. It's yeah, it's definitely an interesting mega trend over the next kind of 5, 10 years to think about where and how this shapes the global economy, especially as I'd imagine the world would become more egalitarian in regards to having somebody who works 5 miles away to could come to an office with the similar capabilities as somebody who's living say 200 miles away, who might be living in a country with poor economic conditions. Ultimately, they're doing the same job, and so eventually, if all companies are kind of trying to get those kinds of individuals in their organization, it's going to start to inflate the salaries and ecosystems of those people in a really positive way.
Yeah, and I think that is really positive, and you'll be aware that in some jurisdictions, in some or maybe all of the United States, it's no longer legal to ask a candidate what their current earnings are. The idea is that if you ask someone who's earning $30,000 a year what their salary is, and they say 30,000, then you're probably going to offer them 35 or 40,000. But if you offered an equally good candidate a job and they're currently earning 70,000, then you're going to offer them 80. You'll pay what you need to. And I really like the fact that some jurisdictions are moving away from being able to do that, because it has discriminated against underrepresented minorities, ethnic minorities in particular. And it's perpetuated some of that discrimination. And I love the idea that it will bring a
Mm,
little bit egalitarianism, is that the word,
yeah.
to some of these salaries, particularly for global workers in working in poorer economic territories.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll come to the last question just because I'm conscious of time, but I was really keen to understand what your top three takeaways that you hope our audience, particularly those working in senior marketing roles at deep tech startups, could hopefully gain from our conversation today.
Well, I think if you're, I mean, my deep area of expertise is interviewing best practices, really, and I work on both sides of the fence, advising companies and also coaching candidates to coaching good candidates to give great performances in their interviews. And I think I'd probably the three things I'd say are, firstly, functional fit is important, but cultural fit. So, a candidate's fit with your cultural values is probably even more important, because particularly for companies that are growing fast, small companies growing fast, scaling quickly, your company and that role may look very different in 12 months' time from the way it looks now. So I would strongly encourage people to hire, to ask the question when they hire someone: does this person share our cultural values? Do they have a track record of exhibiting those values? And would they be a good hire for our company, regardless of what role we put them in? Okay, because the role may look very different, or we may need them to turn their hand to something if we get a new requirement in a few months. So that's the first thing I'd say. Be really,
Yeah,
really
culture
focused on.
trumps functional expertise ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, functional's kind of a prerequisite, isn't it? You can't someone to do a job if you can't hire someone to do a job if they simply can't do it and can't learn to do it. But I personally, I think culture does trump functional. Um, the second thing I'd say, which is related to that, is that train your interviewers to interview consistently across the company, and bring some shadowing in, or something like a bar raiser, a senior interviewer in, to shadow those people, or to work with them on interviews, and train them to get really good at asking behavioral questions. Tell me about a time you delivered a project under a tight deadline. And we're asking that question because we have a lot of tight deadlines, and we need someone who's got a track record of delivering things quickly, even when they don't, even when it would have been quite easy just to sit back and take stock and do things a bit more slowly. So think about your behavioral questions, and enlist the help of someone who can help you devise some behavioral questions based on your values, if that's what you need to do. And then finally, again, it's a related point. My third thing would be try and be patient. You have constraints and you need to hire quickly, but try and be patient, because if you've ever had to unpick someone else's bad hire, you realize that it was counterproductive to hire that person in the first place. So be patient and hire well, and look for long-term effectiveness where you can within your constraints.
Ed, it's wonderful. Thank you so much for all of your insight and wisdom that you've been able to share with us today.